So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Luis Carrasco. I work with the North Carolina Center for Geographic Information and Analysis, and I welcome you to our first afternoon panel called AddressNC Is A Go. We'll be sharing this panel with Mr. Bob Coates, who is the Governor's Census Liaison for the Office of State and Budget and Management. He'll be talking about North Carolina and AddressNC. Also, we have Joe Siwash, Mr. Joe Siwash, who is the Enterprise GIS Architect for the North Carolina Center for Geographic Information Analysis. He will be talking about staying informed on the addressing landscape. Both gentlemen have plenty of information about the nationwide environment and all the developments surrounding the addressing world. So welcome again. And I'll be starting this panel by talking about AddressNC, a statewide effort to develop an addressing resource for every single North Carolinian. So we'll hope to provide a few minutes for everyone to give us questions after each of our talks. All right. So I'm going to be talking briefly about each of these topics. I'm going to keep it short because it's a lot of information. But before we get started, I'd like to know how many of you needed to know an address this morning. No one? Everyone knew the conference? Okay, very good. Yeah, a few people. And how many of you needed an address-based service, like Google Maps, for instance? All right, very good. Now, how many of you need an address in your everyday work? Very good. So we know the importance of having the correct information incorporated into our daily practices. So we know about the value of that information and what are the benefits from having it. And we're also, I believe, aware of the costs involved of having wrong information in our daily data sets. So that's why we started this program. We've been polishing the business case for AddressNC for several years, and the idea is to develop a framework for supporting a centralized repository for addresses of all North Carolina. That could lead to provide services, multiple enterprise services that local governments and state agencies could use as well. Among one of those services, we also consider supporting the Census Bureau's operations for the upcoming 2020 decennial census. And that's a task that we cannot do just alone, like two people in one office. We cannot do that in a silo. We need to have plenty of collaboration from different organizations, not only state organizations, but also local governments, as you can see. So we formed a core project team. As you can see, AddressNC is a program managed by CGIA, which belongs to the Government Data Analytics Center, and which is also part of the Department of Information Technology. Several of our committee members work in different state organizations, but we also have great collaboration from local governments, and actually that's pretty paramount for this particular program, as you will see later. So far, this is what we have done. In late September, in early September, we approved a charter for the program to get started. We had about 3 steering committee meetings since then, and several core project team meetings as well. The main idea is for all of us to be aligned under the same goals and objectives. This also has allowed us to evaluate several different business cases that representatives from other agencies and local governments are bringing to us. Our planning phase, we hope to finish it by the end of February. So as part of our planning, we needed to start a survey to collect requirements for developing the functional requirements aspect of this program. At the same time, our colleagues from Carolina URISA, and some of them are involved in our steering committee as well, they had a need for knowing better the addressing professional communities, their practices and needs. So all this convergence led to us fusioning all our needs into a single survey that I'm not sure how many of you have participated in. Could you raise your hand if you participate in our survey? See one hand? Okay, a few, all right. Okay. Well, I'm not sure if our survey answers are going to be biased now. We may. So the results from this survey, as you can see, represent to some extent how many people like you use addresses for their daily operations. So we had participation from towns, cities, some regional partnerships or organizations, and also from counties. Out of these 87 participants, we have about 61 that identify themselves as addressing professionals. I'm going to talk very little about some of the key results of this survey, because I want to talk more about how we use this information, or how we plan to use this information for our planning purposes. So most addresses are assigned in a GIS department or a planning department. However, other participants mentioned some, let's say, different naming conventions for their divisions. For instance, information technology and planning. We have different mixes of names there, but also we have emergency services departments providing or assigning addresses, followed by permitting offices and buildings, and building inspections, and very little by taxes, by tax departments. So usually the job is done by one person, in some cases by two persons all working full time, but in some situations we have that this job is done by just a one part-time staff. And what does North Carolina assign addresses to? So we have this representation of what it is assign an address, and we notice that it's not just residential or commercial. We are trying to, the state is trying to, the local governments are trying to assign an address to everything that represents value to their business purposes. We have a large transition from from residential to commercial to try to capture most facilities that are needed. This graph shows that about 61% of the participants assign about 10 or less addresses per week. If we take this information at face value, we are talking about 31,000 addresses per year that are assigned. That's just on the low range. In the highest range, we're talking about 75,000 records. Since our last consolidation was by the end of 2014, by the end of this year, we'll have a backlog of about 90,000 records to 210,000 records. And that's just considering what these local governments are actually assigning addresses to, which is not everything yet. So in terms of standards, and this is a topic that Mr. Joe Seawash will provide more details about. From our participants, we know that internal addressing policies are the most prevalent. However, they apparently take a look at National Emergency Number Association standards as well. Some are not aware of whether they're using a standard or not, and very few are using the FEDC standard. And this is all according to this survey. So our addressing colleagues are very busy. Addressing layers or themes are not the only thing, are not the only data that they collect. They are in charge of many other GIS infrastructures that have become very important. And all of that is mainly to know who's going to be providing data to make this system work, which is why we have this particular flow chart in which the help, the participation of the local government user is going to be paramount to make it work. So that's just one part of the equation. The other part is who gets to use these services. For that, we needed to get more detailed information about what are the business cases, what are the business needs from the user community. And for that matter, we collected user stories. How many of you are familiar with user stories or have used user stories? Okay, very good, 2 people. So mainly, and simply put, user stories are tools that are used in product development and in software development. However, they have applications in many other fields as well. They help us capture needs of different clients in a very simple way. So, for instance, they follow this particular structure where we have to identify, our client has to identify a role, provide an outcome, mention optionally a quality requirement, and also assign a value. Without a value, this sentence becomes incomplete. An example for this time of the day would be, I need to have access to strong coffee so I can make it throughout the conference today. So that will be a very complete user story. Now I cannot give you coffee, but there's a lot of coffee that you can have later. Hopefully it's strong enough. So, but we were going to see what we got in our survey. So we collected user stories from our, starting with our colleagues, with our partners from the steering committee. In particular, the Department of Revenue, they were very helpful. We got also user stories from the Department of Transportation and from the Next Gen 911 program. We reviewed those user stories and went through a process of trying to polish them and trying to make sure that we understood their businesses. So that was a very good example, I think, of collaboration, a very good opportunity for understanding what other agencies need. So we did the same with the local governments through this particular survey. And this is a sample of some of the user stories that they selected. We provided some canned user stories to see which ones they felt that represented more their business needs. For instance, let's focus on the first 2. As an address coordinator, I want businesses to integrate with an authoritative addressing system in real time so incorrect address data cannot be created. And I think a lot of us can relate to it. On the other hand, as a data analyst, I want to be able to validate and verify addresses as they're entered in our database system to improve the value of our data. So the role of address coordinator first, and then the role of data analyst, which has probably a more broad context in terms of business needs. We did something similar with state agencies as well, and we got about 25 staff participating in this particular survey. Similar responses, however, the focus was on data analysis, which is interesting for us because state agencies get to use address information apparently in a different way. We're not, I guess most of our colleagues in state agencies are not tasked with curating addresses in a database. However, they need to use it for filling particular business needs. Once we have the user stories. We have to get them through this particular process in which first we need to make sure that they actually fit the scope of this program, and also make sure that they actually represent the actual business need for our partner. So it's important that both parties have a good understanding, a good agreement on what the business need is communicating. The next stage is what I call the hard truth. Okay, it means that if the user story doesn't meet a financial, technological, or cultural feasibility, it will need to go back and it needs to be reassessed. We cannot focus on user stories or business needs that we cannot or we don't have the budget to satisfy. All of those who pass this stage need to be then prioritized. Why? Because we only have limited funds to to develop or to implement this program. There are some elements that need to be implemented on the first iteration of the program, and others that could be implemented at a later stage. So now we have, with this information, a better idea of how the initial user, or very critical user class, how it looks like, what it looks like, and what they need, and also a better idea of how the end user, what they need, and what are their preferences for implementation. Now the rest for us is to be able to design and develop how the system is going to work, making sure that both business needs, the business needs on both ends are met. This is just on a bridge diagram showing how the system should work. We are currently working in a more complex diagram with and actually a document with the core functionality that we need for making AddressNC work on its first iteration. And what's next? So we need to finalize the planning, the formal planning, able to review the system requirements and specification. Also, we need to evaluate whether this solution can be done in-house, partially contracted out, or if there are software solutions that can help us implementing all those pieces in between. So our vision is that each version of AddressNC should satisfy those business needs that we have collected and also meet the selected requirements. Our long-term plan is to provide authoritative address data and address-based services for all of North Carolina. So with that, if you have any questions, please, we have a few minutes left before Bob starts his new presentation. Any questions? No? Will you participate in our next survey? All right. Do it, please. We need better data next time. Okay? Yes?
I guess the simplified workflow version indicated an intent for the API piece.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit more about the types of APIs that we would envision from AddressNC as a service and who could access those?
Okay, that's a good question. In terms of API, so we are envisioning that anyone from the local governments or the state governments can access our information, transitioning from sharing files, which was what we've done in the past, to actually accessing all our information through an API, so through an advanced programming interface. So selected records will be available to local governments or to, for instance, colleagues in the health department, so they can use that information readily for their business practices. That's one way to use API. So Another one is for address verification and geocoding as well. That's just those are just a few examples of what an API can do for the community. Yes, David. The second block. All right. So the idea is that a local user, for instance, David, right, would be able to access a website where you can provide information, your latest upgrade of Wake County data, and that should be it. So after that, that information will be passed through a different process where the system will be able to standardize it, assign a unique user ID, and provide you also with some information that could be valuable to you as well. For instance, what records we have already, or what records need review, and information like that. Does that answer your question?
So is it up to local government to push the data up, or?
We hope to develop that in conjunction with local governments. Mm-hmm. The idea is that we need to make sure, I mean, we know that all of you are very busy, so we cannot afford to have a system that asks you to do more work. The idea is that the easier for you is to provide us with data, the better it is for you. So that's why we need to work together. Mm-hmm. Any other question? Yes?
So I'm familiar with addressing, dealing with residences and businesses and that sort of thing, but when you start talking about addresses of utility poles and fire hydrants and that kind of thing, that's how you work with that before. So what is that? Are you talking about coordinates being the address or something different?
Could you repeat a little bit your question? I couldn't hear very well.
So when you're addressing landmarks,
Right.
power poles, fire hydrants, or whatever, you mentioned that. How is that done? Are you referring to a coordinate being an address, or is there something more analogous to a street address?
It's a mixture of both. So in terms of the addressing, there are several standards that we are looking at, and the idea is to have the actual all the text elements plus the geocodes of the actual facility or residence that we're looking at. And we recognize that not all, actually that local governments have different priorities for assigning addresses as we capture from our survey. So not all, actually very few counties will be providing with more than residences and commercial infrastructure. But we have to be able to capture everything that they are collecting so they can access it through a centralized software. Thanks for your question. Any other question? Yes.
Will there be any personally identifying information consumed, and what will be the recommendation to local governments in terms of how they provide their data?
Very good. We are not collecting any personal identifiable information. We only want addresses and selected fields, but we don't want any names, anything that could identify a person by any means. When we did the consolidation in 2014, our recommendation was that if you were sending us a shapefile or any other file that included names of residents, for instance, that you deleted that field before you send that to us. What we did during our process was to delete that field if it was present. So for this particular iteration, we don't need that information. We don't want it. We're not going to keep it. That's it.
So is that going to be one of the things that we talk about, is what sort of information you guys will be asking of us so that we can build this correctly from as early as we can?
That's right. We'll be providing more information in the future as we finish the system requirement specifications.
Great.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hi, I work for the Division of Environmental Quality, and one of the things that we struggle with is the growing use of land use restrictions, where there's going to be residual leftover contamination, and how do we protect future use of that property. What I'm hoping is to kind of look into a system like this, that we can have our data about the existing contamination on a property tied to an address, hopefully available to like no-cuts or other utilities and real estate.
That's something that we have to talk about. We had some. We need to be aware that I'm going 40 seconds over my time, and that's, for instance, something that initially will be out of scope for us because we are mainly concentrated in addressing information. How you connect that information, how you link that information to any other theme. It's a matter of a different discussion. We'll be more than happy to talk to you afterwards. Okay. So I'm going to let now Mr. Bob Coates, the governor's census liaison, provide his talk on North Carolina and AddressNC. Thank you very much for your presence.
Do I just change it here? Yeah. Great. Hi, folks. I know you've had lunch now, you're settling in, and the last thing you want to do is hear me talk about census-related stuff, but that's what I'm going to do, so prepare yourselves. I'm Bob Coates. I am the governor's census liaison. I'm also an analyst in the Demographic and Economic Analysis section of the North Carolina Office of State Budget and Management, and I'm the coordinator for the North Carolina State Data Center Program, which is a partnership between about 45 state agencies, state and local government agencies, and the U.S. Census Bureau to disseminate information. So, I'm also getting over the plague, so excuse me. The last question was a good segue into what I'm going to be talking about. About 15, 12 years ago, getting ready for the 2010 census, I started noticing that my counterparts in other states were organizing their address information to prepare for the 2010 census. And I started talking with state government agencies about, well, what are you doing for addressing? Do you have any needs for, do you have a master address file for North Carolina? And every agency I talked with said, no, we don't have a master address file, but if you get one, we would love to see it. So we started talking about that. We started working on it for the 2010 census. We did participate with the Census Bureau a little bit then with a North Carolina address resource. And from those early stirrings, we've begun to work towards, well, how can North Carolina develop something that will meet census needs? Yeah, but more importantly, will meet our needs as a state going forward. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about now is the applications of addressing to meet North Carolina needs. So, no big surprise, there's a huge need for addressing, and you guys are going to have to put up with some oversimplification from me on a lot of things, but if you have questions, please feel free to ask. So, there's a large demand for addressing from a number of large stakeholders, and you see federal agencies and state agencies, and obviously those units cover a lot of ground. I'm guessing that most of you in here, how many are with local governments, with a county or municipality? So yeah, probably most of you are with local governments. And as Luis mentioned, you guys have a lot on your plate already. The last thing you want to be doing is fielding requests from 10, 12 state agencies, 10, 12 federal agencies asking you for the same information. It's not that the information, that you can't provide the information, it's just you have other things to do. So if there is a way that we could centralize those resources to make your load a little lighter, because right now you're in the middle of all of these folks calling you up asking for information. So the idea is, can we get something that's authoritative that rests on your local knowledge, because you guys are the gold standard for addressing information in your areas. So how can we leverage the work that you're already doing, put it in a location that's seamless, that you guys can take a look at and make sure it's accurate at any time, and that we can route all of our stakeholders to that one place. You can be confident the data that's there is It's what you're providing. It meets the stakeholder needs, and you're not having to field request after request after request. So that was kind of the vision for AddressNC over the experience of just having worked with census stuff over the years. So what are some of the specific examples of how AddressNC may work? And there's millions of them, but we got to pick on somebody. And we have David Cline here from the Census Bureau, and we are ramping up for the 2020 census. So I'm going to pick on the Census Bureau, but it could have been anybody. David's here, and they also do have a booth upstairs. There's also the Census Bureau is on the hook for a presentation in this room tomorrow morning. So if you want to hear some specifics about what's coming from the Census Bureau in detail, I'd encourage you to be here tomorrow morning for that presentation, or ask David, myself, or the folks up at the booth your questions. But as a kind of a commercial for that, the 2020 census is going to be here before you know it. There are a number of geographic programs that are tied to that. Not all of them are address related, but I do want to let you know what's coming. And I'm going to, just to make sure you're awake, I'm going to jump around on this slide a little bit. First of all, the first program that's already underway is at the bottom, the Census Redistricting Program. The first phase of that was the Block Boundary Suggestion Program, and that has wrapped up. We are now into the voting district verification phase. So local boards of elections will probably be hearing more about that, but that's ongoing. And that is mostly a boundary verification issue and not so much an address verification process. Right above that is the GSS. I don't know that anybody, excuse me. I don't know that anyone in here, aside from Joe and the folks up front, may be familiar with that, but that is an address sharing information throughout the decade with the Census Bureau to make sure that the Census Bureau's master address file, or the MAF, is up to date. That's an ongoing program, and the state is participating in that. The BASS program, anybody in here familiar with BASS? Yeah, it's the Boundary and Annexation Survey. It's an annual survey. It's going on right now. The deadline is approaching. I see Mr. Bridgers here from the Secretary of State's office. They're the guardians of that data for the state of North Carolina. And beginning next month, they'll be giving us, Jeff and I, the list of, list of those local governments that haven't responded to the BASS, and we'll be calling you up saying, hey, if you haven't had any changes to your boundaries, we still need to know about it. So the BASS every year verifies, have there been any corporate changes to your boundaries? And that has to be turned in by May to be included with any census products. So you can supply your boundary information after May, but any estimates of your population and any information from any of the census surveys won't reflect that change until the next year. So timing is important. Now we'll skip up to the top. LUCA, the local update of census addresses. As the name implies, that's heavily involved with addressing. Is there anybody in here that's worked with LUCA in the past? A few folks? Yeah. So we're going to talk about that on the next slide. But advanced letters for the LUCA program just went out last month in January. So we're in the ramp-up phases right now. There will be some workshops, promotional workshops to further explain what those are, happening next month. And then the actual work will begin next year, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Excuse me. And then we have the Participant Statistical Areas Program. PSAP is not so much, it is a boundary program, but I don't know how familiar you are with census addresses, but every county is divided up into census tracts. Those tracts are divided into block groups, census block groups, and those block groups are built around census blocks. Census blocks aren't necessarily city blocks, but they could be in an urban area. The Participant Statistical Areas programs allows local governments some say in how those statistical areas, those small sub-county geographies, are designed. So if you're interested in maybe having a neighborhood or a planning district match up with a census block group boundary, the PSAP program is where you would make that recommendation. That would mean that you would be able to get 5-year American Community Survey estimates every year for that block group area. So if you're interested in tracking things like poverty, educational attainment, income information, all the juicy socioeconomic data that comes out of the American Community Survey, that's available for these smaller sub-county statistical areas. You define those during PSAP. It only happens once every 10 years. So if you want to take advantage of that, that's going to be coming late 2018, 2019. So it's not imminent. LUCA is. Also, if you have communities that don't have functioning governments, they're not incorporated, but they are identifiable communities, you can use the PSAP program to designate those areas as what they call census designated places. So you would be able to get statistical data for those places throughout the decade, as if they were an incorporated town. Does that make sense? Sure. Okay, so let's spend a little bit of time talking about LUCA now. As I mentioned, it's the local update of census addresses, LUCA, and the program only happens once every decade. It's an opportunity for local governments to take a look at the master address file, addresses for your jurisdiction. You don't get everybody's, you just get your area. You can review that list and you can provide updates to it. Now, we're only talking about residential addresses and group quarters. Group quarters are things like college dorms or prisons, nursing homes, long care nursing facilities, those types of areas. So the advance letter was just sent out to the tribal leaders and the highest elected officials of every jurisdiction. That went out in January. And as I mentioned, David Cline's office, operations in North Carolina for the 2020 census are being coordinated through the Atlanta Regional Office, and that's where David is based. So the promotional workshops, we're going to schedule those March, probably into April. Those are promotional workshops, just to talk about what LUCA is. In July, there will be, another round of letters will go out, but these letters are going to go out asking those highest elected folks to designate someone who's actually going to do the address verification for their entity. It's not going to be the mayor, it's not going to be the county commissioner that actually does the work, but who's going to actually look at the data and who's going to do that work. Now, in the past, I can tell you that no two censuses are the same and no two LUCAs are the same. So the last time LUCA came around, there were 3 options for participation. The first 2 involved Title 13 confidentiality, where you had to swear not to use the data or share the data with anyone else. And the third option was, we'll just provide you our addresses and you can do with them what you want. This time, option 3 is not existent. So if you're going to participate in LUCA, you're going to have to be sworn to Title 13 confidentiality. That means that if you're looking at the address list the Census Bureau sends you and you see addresses for your area that you don't already have, you can't grab those addresses and plug them into your system. You can't use that data. You can't share that data with anyone else. David, correct me if I'm wrong. Violation is $2,500 fine and $250,000 and or 5 years in jail, or both. Right. So, yeah. So it's a serious fine. So everybody's going to have to, participating in LUCA, you have to be sworn to Title 13 confidentiality. That's everybody that touches the data. Plus, it's only a 120-day verification window. So you have 120 days to verify your addresses. That's true if you are a town of 5 or if you're a town of 500,000. So you're going to have a very tight window to get this done. You need to be planning your resources. Are you going to be contracting out on this? Are you going to be partnering with your county? Are you going to be partnering with the COG to do this? So start budgeting time and resources now on this. So in July, that letter is going to go out asking for the highest elected people to name their designees. And then beginning in October, they're going to start having the actual technical training workshops where we sit down and talk about, well, how is LUCA going to function? What do we expect to see? What format are you going to get the information from? What resources are going to be available to actually do the work? So those workshops are going to be happening in the fall. I'm quite sure David and I will be involved with setting those up as well. Last time we had about one in every regional, local census offices, about 13 to 15 workshops across the state, somewhere in that same ballpark. And then the participation materials will actually be mailed starting next February, so a year from now. And it's 120 days from when you receive your material, so it's going to be a flow basis. You may not get your material in February, it may be March, but as soon as you get your material, the clock is running. Now, since we have some LUCA veterans here, how many people remember the Math Tiger partnership software? There's just a few who are scarred enough to raise their hands. The U.S. Census Bureau created some software to help out with these geographic programs in 2010, and that's what the Math Tiger, MAP is master address file, and Tiger is the geographic geospatial system that the Census Bureau has. So the MAF Tiger partnership software helped users do the updates. It was, for the time, it was fine, but obviously technology has moved on. So now the new software that is being created is called GUPS. It's the Geographic Update Partnership Software. This is a screen capture of what GUPS looks like for the block boundary suggestion process. The GUPS tool is free. There will be modules of it for every census program. So when you heard me mention BASS, you heard me mention PSAP, you heard me mention LUCA, GUPS will work on all of those programs. So if you're not heavily involved with GIS, maybe you're with a smaller town, and you've been relying on paper in the past, GUPS may be a good solution because it grabs exactly what you need from the Census Bureau to do your verification. It maintains the business model the business needs to actually do the work. You can't do anything in GUPS that you're not allowed to do from the census program, so there's some good checking in the background, and it gives you a way to actually provide that information back to the Census Bureau. You're not obligated to use GUPS. If you're very comfortable with ArcGIS, that's fine. You can certainly do that, but it is there to help you out. GUPS training, there is the Census Bureau website has the user guide for GUPS is available. And for all the programs that you're going to hear, right now the GUPS for LUCA is not available, but when it is available, it'll be provided to you if you're interested. And we can certainly, either David or myself can help you out with setting up LUCA training if you and staff members are interested. Okay, so that's census needs. And obviously, addressing is key for those folks. The number from the last time around was looking at the amount of just federal dollars that are obligated based on the U.S. Census Bureau. It's roughly $1,500 per person per year. So every address that you miss, the average household size was, 1.38 persons. So every address is $1,500 per person per year, actually a little more than that. So we want to make sure that everybody in North Carolina, that every address is getting a census questionnaire. That's important to making sure that the tax dollars that North Carolina is spending come back to North Carolina. That's the key to the census. That's why we do it. More importantly for addressing is emergency response. It doesn't matter if it's a residential address or a corporate address. If there's a fire, we want to make sure that the emergency responders are able to get there. So AddressNC takes that census need and says, let's build on to that. Let's make sure that whether it's FEMA or whether it's the local sheriff's department, that if there's an emergency need in an area, we know where those structure points are, whether it's actually a residence or a agricultural structure. They know where fire hydrants and things are. All of those components should be part of the AddressNC model. Because again, what started out for me as a process of making sure that the Census Bureau had what they needed from address purposes got to be a point of what can we do to have something that meets North Carolina's needs without the local governments constantly being bombarded and asking for the same information. Again, the gold standard is always you folks. And whereas with the local upgrade of census addresses, those address letters are going to be going out to, the LUCA participation letters are going out to every local government. And you certainly have the right to participate, and it's your information. What we're trying to do for LUCA is saying, from the statewide perspective, is say, if you don't have the time or resources, we're going to respond on behalf of North Carolina. And if you've had a chance to look at the AddressNC information and you know that that's current and up to date, it may free you up to do other tasks. It's just an option. Now, I mentioned I'm in the Office of State Budget and Management, and to talk a little bit about state needs for addressing. Excuse me. We have a State Demographer in North Carolina. Is anybody aware of that? Just a few folks. Okay. Well, how many people are aware that that position has been vacant for about a year? So, yeah, our previous State Demographer, her husband found a fantastic job in Boston, and she was gone very quickly. The good news is we have a new State Demographer, and he's not David Cline, he's Mike Cline, and he will be starting with us on April 3rd. So I told Mike that I wasn't going to throw him under the bus, but I was going to get him very close to the curb. So his email address is michael.cline@OSBM, Office of State Budget and Management, .nc.gov. Now, there's some chuckles out there because some of you are aware that the State Demographer is tasked with providing state-certified population counts for every county and municipality and the state each year. There's also population projections for counties and the state, and those population estimates involves age, race, and sex breakdowns. That data is tied specifically to state programs for distributing state funds out. So they're very important data, and to do that, the State Demographer does a survey each year to the local governments asking for, have your boundaries changed? What are your new addresses looking like? What kind of group quarters do you have in your area? All this kind of stuff that the Census Bureau is asking. So it's a duplication of effort. The state is asking you the same questions that the Census Bureau is asking. Now, the State Demographer's process, is paper-based right now, and it's a manual process. So you get a big envelope, and you folks are very busy, so you set the envelope aside. There's opportunities for things to get missed, and then we have to do follow-up with you folks. A lot of you folks are great with sending that information back into the office, but we have old eyes, so is that a 4 or is that a 7? I can't quite tell. So there's got to be better ways for us to do that process, to lighten the load on you, to get it to be a cheaper process to do, and to make sure that we're more efficient with our time and resources. Now, before I go ahead with talking about how the State Demographer's process is going to change, I have a big disclaimer. We are planning on changing the process of how the State Demographer does their work. It is not going to happen overnight. We're not going to flick a switch, and you guys are going to have to learn a whole new process. It is going to be an evolution, so we're going to start small. We're actually just talking about moving from paper to an electronic format, but we have a vision about where we'd like to go. So what I'm going to be talking about is the vision of where the State Demographer's process is going and how AddressNC would fit into that, but it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's going to be a time process. So with that disclaimer being said, and everybody saying, yes, we heard you, it's not happening tomorrow, here's what's happening. So instead of getting an envelope with a couple of form letters and a printout of all your addresses and a printout of what we have for your boundary changes and a printout of group quarters information, you'll get an email with a secure link. You'll have a user ID and a password, and when you get into that, you will see a representation of your jurisdiction. So would there be a dynamic map saying, here are the boundaries that we have for your area? Is that correct? And you might be able to correct any boundary changes in the same way, it's sort of what you saw with GUPS. You would be able to correct your boundary changes there. It would access AddressNC and say, okay, we're accessing the addresses from this point. What are the new addresses between this year and last year? And it would show you those either on the map or as a tabular display. You'd be able to say those are correct or you missed these addresses. It would do the similar sort of thing with group quarters. So your information would be displayed. You can only see and edit your information, not any other information for other municipalities. And there's a digital signature area and a feedback area. So you're able to provide some comments. You missed this area. This is incorrect. You should have had this. You're letting us know what's incorrect. And there's a sign-off area on that for you to say, okay, this is okay with us. Now, that information that comes back to us gets fed into the State Demographer. The State Demographer will review it to make sure that there's not anything that looks odd to them before putting it into their models for generating the population estimates and projections. Any changes that you have imported at that point that have to do with boundaries would be routed to our friends in the Bass field with the Secretary of State's office. Any addressing changes that you would come up with would go to AddressNC so that they could take a look at, well, what are we missing between our process from saying here are the addresses we have for this town and what the town is providing to us. So there's no change. What you're doing through the State Demographer's process doesn't automatically change the AddressNC product. It simply notifies the AddressNC team that there's a change that needs to be made there. So what we're looking at doing is making sure that the authoritative information from the local governments is making it into AddressNC, and any feedback that happens, that there's always quality control, and if there's any variation between what we're reporting and what you're giving us, that's worked out between AddressNC and the local governments. So what that would mean would be, hopefully, what you're seeing in the State Demographer's new product that pops up on your screen should be no surprises at all because it's the information that you've already provided. So there should be a lot less hassle on your end. You won't have to worry about stuff getting lost because it's right there. And then any changes that you make are already in AddressNC, so AddressNC can support you with emergency management, all other state needs, but it can also support the census once every 10 years. And actually, since the Census Bureau is doing so many more surveys, the ask on address updates is more frequent. The GSS is all the time. So we're constantly in the market then for better data because the Census Bureau has better addresses. We're better serving our communities, and you folks are being accessed less to provide that same information for the same purposes. So this is what that model, the picture at the very beginning, the oversimplified picture of address demand where you guys were caught in the middle at the local government level. AddressNC kind of makes you the gold standard that's supporting AddressNC, and AddressNC is in the middle of all the demand. Again, you're still the authority, it's just the authority is creating the resource. Okay. That's enough of me running my mouth. There's my contact information, email and phone number. What questions do y'all have about any of that? Yes, ma'am.
Who usually gets the surveys from the demographer?
State Demographer. Ordinarily, it is the highest elected official, but in some cases, it may be the manager, town manager, or the clerk. That's a relationship that goes on every year. The survey's done annually. So we have a contact database of who responded last year, and it usually goes back to that same person. Yes, sir.
So we've got a hodgepodge of different addresses. We might have a 600 address within a 300 block, and happens to be on the even side instead of the odd side. Anyway, I guess my question is trying to get information from the post office and the feds on the IRS. Surely they've got a lot of this information. They just won't release. How do we?
Well, we just have another person from the Census Bureau that walked in, so we can all look at them and shake our fist. Part of it is the Census Bureau, and given what they have to do, count everybody in a nation as dynamic as ours is. That's a really tough job. And they take confidentiality very seriously, and I think all of us should be appreciative of that. They get an awful lot of information, and they don't share it with anybody. But from the people who are doing the nuts and bolts work like we are, it's very frustrating for them not to be able to share the address information that they have. But that's just the way, that's the world that we're in right now. The good thing about the AddressNC tool is it's outside of that federal silo. So hopefully, for North Carolina purposes, we would be able to share amongst ourselves. Part of what you're asking, too, is also about data quality standardization. How do we make sure that we're kind of all on the same page with that? I'm going to defer that to Joe because that's what he's going to be talking about next, but it's a very good question. Yes, ma'am.
The basic answer though is the local government creates addresses in this country. They're not created by the post office, they're not created by the IRS or the feds or anybody else. And what a person thinks his address is may or may not agree with what your official record says. You're the authority, the local government. So asking the IRS or the Census Bureau to tell you what's right or wrong is kind of pointless.
I agree.
If it's wrong, you need to fix it. And then
But
you
we
need to
can't
let
use their
all those
name.
other people know that they're using the wrong thing. I mean, from a legal standpoint and a process standpoint, that's how it works. The state can't fix it, feds can't fix it, census isn't going to change anything you tell them is right.
Yeah, I guess the issue is just to have database of what we actually did in the past.
Yeah, well, that's something you need to do. Because no one else is going to do it.
It's part of the structure of what, and Luis mentioned it earlier. When we started talking about what is the structure, what are we going to need in terms of the fields and all that go into this, we started by looking at, well, what do we know is going to be asked by the Census Bureau? And we don't need to be locked into that. But part of it is there's going to be quirks that are there. So whether a road name is spelled this way or that way, it's going to make a difference on whether addressing a census survey through AddressNC gets to that location. Which way should it be spelled? That's the purview. That's going to be the local government that says, no, we issued the address. It's spelled like this. That's the way it should be. And AddressNC is going to rely on that. Laura?
One of the things that both of Census Bureau and the U.S. Post Office, they have, we accepted through GSS, as Bob talked about, addresses and then we update our database and match it to our database, so it's updated from the local source. The U.S. Post Office actually does have a system on their website where they accept it through, and they depend heavily on the local governments providing their updates. That's the only way they're getting their updates to make sure that they're correct. So one of the things that we do get from the post office is change of address files. And you might think that's just a simple file, but it's not. When you guys need address, where a lot of people would roll out to actually individual, one addressing, that change of address file is a huge file for us to have to go through. So every time there's a change of address or you have a name change for a road, we have to use that file to try and do it. So the preference is to get it from the local, because your location spot is going to be more accurate than us trying to get that from any other source. You know your houses. So when you have an address that, when you have a street where you have one side of the street is one name, and another side of the street is another name, which by the way happens all over the country, or if a street wraps around and renames it, and there's no way that an address range is going to work. That point location is how we're going to know to get to the right spot and be able to G-code correctly. So you guys are critical to having an accurate data set and getting to the right location.
And the post office, that post office change files about 3 million addresses a year, which has been 3 million changes to addresses reported by local government student post office. So it's not trivial.
So, enlarged with the Census Bureau, and again, they do great work. What we're talking about with AddressNC is the feed into what they're doing with the Geographic Support System Initiative. So we'd be providing addresses to them to improve address quality with the Census Bureau throughout the decade and hopefully make LUCA easier on local governments who choose to participate. But the point of AddressNC is not solely to prepare us for the census. It's to meet statewide needs and also the census needs. So it's what we're doing for ourselves as a leverage tool and as an efficiency over time. These are all great questions, and it's a good time to have the census conversation. In the interest of time, though, I want to go ahead and wrap up my time. Thanks for being patient, and if you have additional questions about census applications, we can talk after the session or up at the census booth. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Joe Seawash. As Luis introduced me earlier, I'm with the North Carolina Center for Geographic Information and Analysis as Enterprise GIS Architect. In terms of background, I've been with CGI for now almost 12 years. I'm also currently a member of the National States Geographic Information Council Board of Directors, co-chair, thank you very much, co-chair of the NISJIG Next Gen 911 Committee, and also seated on the Federal Geographic Data Committee's Address Theme Subcommittee. To start out, I'm going to paraphrase Luis's earlier user story. Because I couldn't get coffee before the session, I'm going to wear this lavalier mic and walk around, because even though the session is titled Staying Informed on the Address Landscape, it may as well be informed Address Standards, a Cure for Insomnia. So I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes and leave time for questions both on my session as well as for Luis and Bob. I saw earlier that we have a significant portion of today's audience that are from local governments. Who in the audience participated in the addressing workshop yesterday? Okay. Did anybody attend the Next Gen 911 presentation, early bird presentation at 8:30 this morning? Who attended the CURISA addressing special interest group at lunchtime? So there were a lot of folks that raised their hands all 4 times. And so what I want to be able to do today is give you some resources to be able to put the pieces together, because as Luis's slide about which standard are you using at the local government level, and there was a variety of choices, I would hint that some of the others were probably hybrids of multiple standards or that cross over, but also drawing back to Bob's slides of overlapping uses and overlapping considerations when you're looking at this material information. What I want to be able to do in this session is point you to a half dozen or so documents that will provide some background information, will cure your insomnia, but also be able to show how the pieces start to fit together, both in a technical standpoint as well as a practical standpoint. So the first group of documents that I want to talk about are documents that, for February 23rd of 2017, we'll call these documents static. They're not in motion, they're not in review, they're not in revision, but they're a stable form for you to look at today. When we come back in February of 2019, this list could look different. So take that with a grain of salt. And also, as we go through each one of these, there will be some URLs that will be at the bottom of the slides. Some of them are pretty straightforward, some of them are pretty arcane. We will make sure, because both Luis and I are with CGIA and we'll work closely with the folks that manage the conference, we'll get these slides up on the website at the earliest possible convenience. So, don't feel compelled to scribble the addresses down. Those will be available through the conference archives later on. So the first document or first piece of information to point to is this U.S. Census Address Data Content Guidelines. When Bob talked about the Census's Geographic Support System Initiative and how data is ingested into the Census master address file, this is a very straightforward document that gives you the elements for both city-style and non-city-style addresses, as well as the metadata to go with each record that will most easily pass through the Census's ingest process. So the address elements deal with things like the street name, the prefix, the suffix, how they want that formatted optimally, and as well as the additional metadata elements. Is it a residential address? Is it a group quarter? When was it last updated? And is it a multi-unit record? So these are things that are very important for Census to be able to address into their master address file. This is elements and materials that you'll be dealing with in the LUCA process that Bob alluded to. And again, one of the longer URLs that you'll see today, again, we'll get these slides updated into the website and archive as soon as possible. The next one to talk about is the National Emergency Number Association Next Generation 911 U.S. Civic Location Data Exchange Format. Very much of a mouthful. The bottom line is this defines the core elements that are used in Next Generation 911 for both call routing. Call routing is when a citizen or a user dials 911, how does the person get connected to the telecommunicator in the public safety answering point? In the Next Gen 911 world, this is all going to be based on an IP network, and everything with CLDXF will be in an IP environment, in an XML environment. Then that's how the person that needs assistance is connected to the PSAP. Again, we've got these core location data elements, how they're supposed to be formed, what they're supposed to be named. The core elements track to the FGDC, U.S. Thoroughfare Landmark, and Postal Address Standard. We'll talk about that one in a couple of minutes. And it also maps those data elements to the Presence Information Data Format Location Object. That's a mouthful, but for short we call it PIDAFLOW. PIDAFLOW is the formatting of the XML document for how the address is passed through the next generation EZINet to the various services for the location validation function and the emergency call routing function that does the work in the background to connect the person that dialed 911 with the telecommunicator based on that coordinate location, tracking it to the PSAP. NENA has also developed, I used that word wrong, NENA, Development of Site Structure Address Point GIS Data for 911. This is how to describe the coordinate location for the address record consistently. So this can be a site structure, what we would normally think of as a house or a building, a commercial area. Subaddresses. Subaddresses are Either they can be apartments, or increasingly in something else that we won't talk about called the National Emergency Address Database, these subaddresses can be dispatchable locations to be able to find, in lieu of having one point address to describe the Raleigh Convention Center, the Raleigh Convention Center could literally have hundreds of subaddresses to be able to navigate first responders to not just the building or curb or entrance, but to the very room, wiring closet, conference room, restroom that the person is calling from. So subaddresses are supported under this site structure address point and also the preceding CLDXF. And we also can define supplemental routing points. So the navigation of the first responder to where they need to go, we can have the points that indicate where the road cut is for very large parcels to be able to translate the directions for the first responders. All of these are accommodated under one of these 5 existing methodologies. So we can geocode off of a road center line. It can be geocoded from a parcel centroid. It can be a particular site or structure within a parcel, and also that property access relating back to supplemental routing points. So this is actually a piece of metadata that corresponds with the addressing record to give more information to the users, and for those, the intent of projects like AddressNC and in other states, the opportunity to be able to put that context so it travels with the individual address record throughout the process. We mentioned the U.S. Postal Service in one of the questions that Laura fielded in the last session. USPS Postal Addressing Standard Publication 28. This is what USPS uses to define their data records, their elements, their formats, as well as the address information system, which is their entire internal system for managing addressing data specific to the business of delivering parcels. And data from the AIS is available either in commercial forms or raw forms. This gives you the knowledge to be able to decode and understand what that information is, what is available, and what the context of that information is. So those statics, or that wraps up the static documents that we want to talk about. Now we want to talk about the active documents, documents that are in process, that are in various stages of development. And again, in the context that we all get together as a group once every 2 years, this gives you a touchstone, if you will, to track information going forward. The first document that we'll talk about is the National Emergency Number Association Standard for Next Gen 911 GIS Data Model. If you were in the 911 session this morning from Richard Taylor, Richard alluded to this document standard. A staff member from Wake County, Rachel Bello, is one of the co-chairs of this group. I also participate in these meetings. This is a process that's been ongoing for about 6 years to develop the GIS data layer standards for Next Gen 911 to support the call routing functions for geospatial call routing, as well as computer-aided dispatch CAD system background for the various GIS layers. As Richard talked about this morning, the layers are segregated into required, highly recommended, and recommended layers. Those layers are defined by which data sets are absolutely minimally required to execute the call routing function and the computer-aided dispatch requirements. The highly recommended and recommended layers are both for quality control and map display for the telecommunicators. So the required layers are road center lines with address ranges, public safety answering point boundaries, and emergency communication boundaries for fire, police, EMS at a minimum, plus any other dispatchable services that a local jurisdiction wants to define. So you could have layers for CDC, you could have layers for State Highway Patrol, you could have layers for anybody that you would want to dispatch, even to, in the FirstNet world, they're talking to public service utilities, to be able to have them dispatch through the PSAP and dispatch system. The site structure address point layer is highly recommended. So this ties back to that document, or the informational document, for identifying the point layers. This defines the elements and the layers for that point address standard. Currently, this document is in what's called the public comment period. It was released on December 16th in the fall. If you're on the NCGIS list, or the NICL-GISA list, or the NG911 addressing list here in North Carolina, you've seen emails from me pointing you to Nina, as well as an online webinar that's about 40 minutes in length that gives folks the background on the standard and also the process by which you can evaluate and submit comments back to the working group for consideration. This public comment period closes next week, so there's a few days. There's a weekend coming up if you're really interested on this. Version 1 of the standard will be completed hopefully by the end of the year. The amount of work and the number of comments that are generated are going to be a direct function as to how close or how tight that deadline is going to be, but it's an internal working group target. Once the working group adjudicates the comments received during the public comment period, it goes through something called all committee review. Well, I'll ask the question, how many folks have looked at the NINA standards website? We've got about 7 insomnia sufferers in the room. There's about approximately 80 standards and informational documents that NINA provides. And this covers all the way from high-level architecture documents for how NextGen works and how the services are provided, all the way down to discrepancy reporting and stewardship of CAD recordings, development of the GIS layers. It's very, very intensive because it's very, very serious work to send first responders to save lives. So there's a lot of work that goes into this all committee review to ensure that we don't have duplicated information, conflicting information across any of the various pieces. There is also a standard form period which gives vendors working in this space the opportunity to evaluate the content of a proposed standard that's made it all the way to this process to ensure that there are no intellectual property issues embedded in the standard that's been developed. Part of every NINA standard includes a specific section for documenting future work. So that a standard like this, for instance, one of the issues that are currently identified for a future version is the layer definition for building footprints. It is an acknowledged issue within the work group. The work group wants to get version 1 complete after 7 years to get that available, standardized, have a benchmark, if you will. Version 2 will begin covering items like that. I believe it's section 2.6 in the standard. As soon as version 1 is complete, the working group intends to begin work on version 2. The other document that actually could have been in the static mode, but I chose to place it just in one place in the under review mode, is the U.S. Thoroughfare Landmark and Postal Data Standard. There is a 2011 version of the document that is available through the FGDC website. You could consider that static as of today. Through 2015 and 2016, there was a work group that developed this changelog document, and I'll add, I do apologize, I need to add the URL there. You'll be able to find it, the URL reference. There are approximately 70 changes in the change log?
There were about 84 in the final list, but about 3/4 of those were changes to the version number of ISO standards or.
Just very editorial.
They're incredibly minor. There are about three that were requested by Census that are a substantive change, and there were probably about 3 or 4 more that were requested by other people, including those of us who wrote it in the first place, sort of things we learned more about. And those are being adjudicated by a group of us. It's a little slow because Census is the maintenance authority, and they're the ones who have to do the work. And they are sort of gearing up for the census for 2020 right now, so it's been a little slow getting it out. But the 2011 version is still in force. It is still a federal standard. You can use it as it is. The changes will happen, but
It's very, very safe.
I would say it's a pretty static document. Yeah, it looks like there might be a lot of comments, but most of them are pretty
Editorial.
almost at the typo level.
Right.
Or some other standard has changed its version number because it's been updated, and we're just, or a URL went dead, and they changed their URL.
Right.
It's stuff like that.
And I guess that
That's already been done.
it's very illustrative of how intertwined all of these documents are, and we want to make sure that they are kept in alignment, but it is an opportunity for perpetual update across any of these standards, which was towards my opening comment when we convene in February of 2019. All of this could have changed by then. So the last segment that I wanted to talk about are groups that either you can participate in or track for future knowledge over the next couple of years. The first is the Federal Geographic Data Committee Address Theme Subcommittee and the CURISA Addressing SIG Working Group that met earlier today. The Address Theme Subcommittee recognizes address points as a theme within the national geospatial management of layers across the U.S. The goal and charge to the subcommittee is to be able to define and implement a national strategy for publicly available, spatially referenced address points. That definition, I think, is pretty much down the middle. It's been voted on once. I think it's going to be voted on again very soon. The committee has been meeting since December. There was a meeting in Washington, D.C. earlier this week. Martha attended. It was primarily for federal agencies. I know that Massachusetts and Maryland were represented on site in a requirements meeting.
Well, that was a requirements meeting on Tuesday.
Right.
And I did attend it. Massachusetts was there. Maryland kind of was there.
Right.
Their former GIO was there. DC was represented by their GIO, or not their GIO, their
CDO. Barney?
no.
Oh,
David Jackson, who runs their
Okay.
master address repository, was there, and there were people from FEMA, FBI, Department of Education, Social Security, the Post Office, Health and Human Services.
wide variety of users.
Transportation Census, of course, had plenty of people there.
Sure.
It was a very, very useful and very well facilitated workshop. It was on what are the federal requirements for a national address database.
Right.
They will proceed outward from there to look at what are how does this work, what are the maintenance requirements, and what are the issues.
So you can see here that, at least my understanding is, because the address theme definition needs to be reviewed and approved by higher levels of the Federal Geographic Data Committee, there eventually will be a website that you can follow. You'll be able to find that website at this URL. That will lead to the full address theme subcommittee page where you can get updates on when the meetings occur, content, agendas, those kinds of pieces. It is a committee that you have to be nominated to, so it's like you can just sort of throw your hand up
delegated as the ERISA representative to that committee, which has been accepted. I think both Christian John from Massachusetts and Kenny Miller were there representing NISJ, as well as.
Well, actually, NISJIG is not represented. There are state representatives that NISJIG helped nominate, but NISJIG as an organization was not represented.
Well, ERISA did have nominees and.
Right.
Ed and I are the designated hitters.
Right.
Because we're in DC. Easy to go to the meetings.
Sure.
But yeah, so there are some non-federal partners that have participated in developing this. The definition of the address theme has been approved by the FGDC executive.
So hopefully we'll get a website very, very soon.
They're working on that.
Laura?
The FGDC Geospatial Platform website is available right now.
Mhm.
And so there's a lot of other things they're doing. The address theme, they're adding it, so I'd recommend that you at least log on and create your account through the FGDC Geo platform, because then you actually can find all the other groups that are going on and all the other themes, so like the one that I run, which is the National Boundary Group theme, is all there, and all of our information is up there. You can learn different things that are happening. And it's a great resource for different standards and different activities that other federal agencies. And we try and encourage all state and local participants to be in our quarterly meetings that we have for different themes. But it is there. And you have to be able to access that, you have to be able to access your address theme. So it's a two-level access system. So keep that in mind.
Okay.
And the address standard, the FGDC address standard, is now up there in wiki format, which means it's totally searchable, rather than PDF that's been up
Right.
for the last 5 years. So that is a real benefit to a lot of folks, along with the data model is available on the platform. Looked at all.
So we want to be able to wrap up with the reference and acknowledgement of the CERISA addressing SIG. The chairs and the board of that group led their first working group meeting today during the SIG meetings at lunchtime. We also want to, from the AddressNC core project team, thank the SIG for having their membership participate in the AddressNC steering committee, as Luis referenced in one of his earlier slides. Their help has been tremendous. Getting the survey into distribution and raising that awareness was very instrumental to the specific results that Luis was able to talk about today. So with that, I wanted to be able to thank everyone for not falling asleep, for putting up with my droning, but we have approximately 7 minutes for you to ask questions of any of the panelists. I didn't do that good of a job. Yes.
When I guess the AddressNC accepts our data, do we have to fall into some kind of standard?
As Luis alluded to earlier, we're in a design phase, and being able to translate those user stories into a recommended structure, we want to be able to provide that structure to the local governments, and also acknowledge that we're not going to be asking local governments to take on onerous tasks or specific elements that they're not already collecting, with the context that there are several instances, particularly in the next-gen realm and the geocoding and verification realm, that the more data you can provide to us, the more we can help you. So a very literal interpretation is the GSS standard, the very first document that I talked about. If you have the ability to flag residential versus commercial address points, or even unknown address points, that helps the AddressNC folks when we engage with our census counterparts to be able to provide them with statewide updates. If that information isn't included in what we receive from the local governments, we have to treat that as an unknown, so that when Census wants residential addresses and we have data from a county that doesn't have any sort of context flag with their information, it limits how much we can help you. that clarification will be part of AddressNC as it develops. And again, I would also point to the GSS recommendation for the multi-unit requirements. The more that you can provide in that for both the content and context information on the address record level, that helps us be more responsive on your behalf. There was a question earlier about DEQ and EPA. I was able to look up a specific reference to EPA's facility reference system. And one of the things that I would suggest is if you can get with Luis and me after the session and we can document that user story, we can integrate that into the AddressNC process. AddressNC is funded by the state for an initial startup and then an annual maintenance piece. And we don't have an infinite supply of resources, but we can always track the user cases and make sure that that's documented so that that rolls into the consideration for how we structure and design the database. Okay, with that, we are 3 minutes from ending. I think Bob and Luis and I can stick around for a few minutes. The moderators ask us to remind you to please evaluate the session in your NCGIS conference app, and thank you for attending.